configuring our app delegate with another guy to whom we're going to delegate control, the view controller. Self.viewController is a property that's built into the app delegate class. So if you actually look up the documentation for a UI application delegate, you'll see that it comes with that property. So we are setting it in that way. Finally, we're setting this is our property that we declared in the .h file, but it comes with a root view controller property in the window. That's in the UI window documentation. And then that second to last line, make key invisible, just gives control to the UI controller to the foreground. What else does this application do? Anything? So that's it. All we have is a nib where we could start to put our user interface, but beyond that, this application does terribly, terribly little. So let's try to see first. Any questions? So let's take a more complex tour and see if we can't now understand a new application entirely, but this time while thinking about it in the context of applications we've seen thus far. So among tonight's source code is a folder called master detail. This is essentially a simplified version of the standard template that comes with Xcode. So all I did was tidy things up and remove things that didn't need to be there. As usual, let's go into our main.m file. Let me close some superfluous windows over there. Nothing new happening here. So that's the same file we saw earlier. What file should we probably dive into next, following the same rule of thumb? OK, so app delegate, start with the .h. That looks perfectly the same, so nothing new there. AppDelegate.m. So here we have what seems to be the same code as before, except for any differences? So we're instantiating a master view controller. So that's interesting. It's not just a view controller. It's a master view controller, and we're making it the root view controller, so to speak. So most of this code is the same, but I'm instantiating a different class name. But that's because someone at Apple decided for this template that we're not going to have one view controller implemented for you in .h and .m. We're going to have what appears to be two, master view controller and detail view controller. So at this point, I'm a little puzzled as to what this thing's going to do. So let me go ahead and just run the application and see if we can't then work backwards as to how the behavior we're about to see is functioning. So let me go ahead and foreground the simulator. And in just a moment, we'll see it pop to the foreground. Lately, the simulator has been loading a little slowly, but there we have it. And now we have, interesting, an application that has nothing going on here. You can just about see the horizontal line. So this is some kind of tabular view going on. And this application, the starting point, is designed just to do something stupid, just to insert a new row every time you click the plus, and it's choosing the timestamp in UTC, so universal time, and adding a row accordingly. So if I do that ad nauseum, we'll just get lots and lots of rows. But you might recall this paradigm in iOS. If I click Edit, I get this familiar UI. I can go ahead and delete, say, that one by clicking that circle, then clicking the Delete button. Then I can say Done. And so there we have that functionality. And if I click a row itself, detail view content goes here. So what's just happened, apparently, is that we've made some kind of transition from the master view controller to what they call the detail view controller. So this is illustrative now of how you can hand off control between two view controllers. Recall that you've essentially been doing this in the utility application, or you will soon be doing this in the utility application for Evil Hangman, but you were choosing a different type of transition. Rather than side to side, you were doing front to back flipping. So this one still is a little different in its implementation. Let's next go into, from appdelegate.m, let's start with masterviewcontroller.h. Is there anything of interest in here? So master view controller has a property that's going to store the address of what kind of object? Looks like a detail view controller. So if you think about this high level, the root view controller is the master view controller. He apparently is somehow going to have attached to him the address of a detail view controller. So it seems to be the case, indeed, that the master view controller is in charge. Now, we haven't done any of that wiring yet, so let's go into the .m file for master view controller, get the lay of the land. Damn, this looks a little overwhelming, but we'll get there. So now let me scroll back up to the top and see what's interesting here. So let's focus first on one of these at a time. So here's a method called initWithNibName. This has typically been called automatically for us because we've had a bunch of starting points in our applications thus far in class where we had those .xib files. Somehow they were wired up to my code and loaded automatically, and we would just initialize them based on the XML file that is the .xib file somewhere on my hard drive. But now we're explicitly implementing an init with nib name bundle method, and if I hover over this thing and check the question mark, notice that there's a whole bunch of documentation in here, and this method appears to come from an ancestor class known as UI view controller. So if we really look underneath the hood, master view controller descends from a new class that gives us the tabular view, UI table view controller, which in turn descends from the thing we've seen in applications thus far, UI view controller. So long story short, if I actually start to read this documentation, this will explain how the init with nib name bundle method works, and it is the guy that's responsible for loading from the hard drive that .xib file and somehow making all of the connections we discussed last weekend in lab. So it's doing one additional thing, though. It's calling first the superclass's implementation of that same method, init with nib name bundle. So that's been called automatically for us because we have not explicitly implemented this method thus far. But it's also doing what in high-level terms, apparently? What does it appear to be doing? You seem to have a guess in mind. Oh, yes, you. Initializes the, oh, the first line does, yes, sorry. Let me change my highlighting. So it's not commented, but what do these three lines seem to be doing? Yeah, it's setting the title of self. So self.title, what is self? What type of object is self at this point in time? So it's a master view controller, which in turn is a UI table view controller, which in turn is a UI view controller. So if we really started poking around the docs, we would probably see that UI view controllers have a property called title. And indeed, that's where this is coming from, or UI table view controllers. And if we go back to the application that was running, notice when we're here, the title master, that's where that came from. So we could have typed this in manually into the nib, but because we created the view controller in code, we don't actually have to do that there. All right, so this, as an aside, is a common paradigm. Anytime you modify self, it's common to check is self. If self is non-null, so that is if everything went okay and the previous line did not return nil, meaning there's some memory error or the like, you check first that self exists okay before touching one of its properties, as we did here with self.title. All right, so next, I think we saw this last time. View did load. We saw this in our no nib example, I believe. View did load, if we read the documentation, is just the method that's called when the view did load, so aptly named. And what does this guy seem to be doing? It's wrapping a bit, but it's about 4 lines of code total. Yeah, it seems to be adding the edit button. So first we call the parent version of the method, and if we read the documentation, we will be reminded typically, be sure to call the parent before you do your own thing. Self.navigation.left button bar item. I don't really know where this comes from, but I can probably guess that because we are implementing a subclass of a UI table view controller, presumably a UI table view has a property called navigation item. And that navigation item refers to the little blue or gray bar at the top of this kind of application. And .left button item refers to, .left bar button item refers to the thing at top left. And we seem to be storing what there? Self.edit button item, whatever that happens to be. And then UI button item, add button. So if we read this, we're apparently instantiating a UI bar button item, allocating it, initializing it with this thing, UI bar button system add. So there's a lot of code there. That's not all that interesting to dwell on now, but if you think back to what's going on, this is really just the code version of going to something like my nib, opening up the toolbar over here, scrolling down to the objects down here, and if we scroll, we'll eventually find navigation bar and navigation item. So what I'm doing in code is the equivalent of dragging and dropping this into the user interface, much like we were doing last week. So that's all. The magic that we've been taking for granted of dragging and dropping is now being implemented more lower level in code. All right, so let's not worry too much about the user interface, because that's not all that interesting at the end of the day. Let me just point out a few of the additional methods we've implemented. These are methods that we've implemented because we need to implement table-related functionality. One of these is super simple. the method called number of sections in table view. If you read the documentation, its purpose in life is to return a number, namely how many rows should there be in the table, so that the operating system knows when to stop rendering rows. So in this case, we've just returned, sorry, not rows, sections. So sections are groupings of rows together. And if you have an iPhone and you go to your settings menu, you'll see that there are rows in your settings menu, but they're typically clustered with some kind of bold header. That's referring to a section. We had no such aesthetics here, so we just have one massive section. So they have hard-coded the value of 1 in this template. So next, table view, number of rows in section. So this is the method